A joy to look at my screen and see this virtual Beit Midrash as it continues to fill up. And it is a joy and honor to welcome all of you to the first session of this four-part series entitled Job's Case Against God. We are overjoyed to have as our teacher, my teacher, Professor Ed Greenstein. It was some 32 years ago that I had the privilege as a rabbinical student at the Jewish Theological Seminary to study at the dust of the feet of this amazingly talented and creative scholar. In addition, I want to say about Ed, he is the ultimate mensch, Talmid Chacham, and a true philologist. And in that merit of being a philologist, one who studies words, I would like to quote from Friedrich Nietzsche's Daybreak, which he wrote in the autumn of 1886. He writes the following, quote, "For philology is that venerable art which demands of its votaries one thing above all, to go aside, to take time, to become still, to become slow. It is a goldsmith's art and connoisseurship of the word, which has nothing but delicate, cautious work to do, and achieves nothing if it does not achieve it lento. But for precisely this reason, it is more necessary than ever today. By precisely this means does it entice us and enchant us the most in the age of work, that is to say, of hurry, of indecent and perspiring haste." Remember, he wrote this in 1886, which wants to get everything done at once, including every old or new book. This art of philology does not so easily get anything done. It teaches to read well. That is, to read slowly, deeply, looking cautiously before and after, with reservations, with doors left open, with delicate hands and fingers. Ed Greenstein is truly a connoisseur of the word. He is a craftsman of the word. And now, for the formal bio. Ed Greenstein is Emeritus Professor of Biblical Studies at Bar-Ilan University. Earlier, he was professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and at Tel Aviv University. He has published widely in biblical and ancient Near Eastern studies. His annotated translation of Job won wide acclaim. He is currently writing a full commentary on Job and several other books. And as we open, I also want to add that on May 6th, I received an incredibly beautiful and touching email from Ed in which he wrote the following, that he wants to dedicate this four-part series in honor of Chancellor Shuli Rubin Schwartz. He wrote the following to me, and we are so delighted and overjoyed that Chancellor Shuli Rubin Schwartz is here with us right now. Thank you, Shuli, so much for joining us. It's so wonderful to see you. Ed wrote the following, "In honor of Shuli Schwartz, who has proven herself to be someone who is not only an exemplary leader, but someone who understands the core values of Judaism profoundly." Shuli, this is our opportunity in the Schechter community to say Mazal Tov again to you on all of your accomplishments. We were so proud having you as a leader of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and as that role comes to a conclusion as you near the finish line, we send you all of our love, and we thank you for your extraordinary leadership. And Ed, thank you for making this dedication to an extraordinary Rebbe in our midst. Shuli.
I thank you. I thank you both. I'm so touched, deeply touched. Ed, I'm so moved, as you know, as I've expressed to you privately. Thrilled that you've chosen to honor me in this way, in a way that also honors the Schechter Institute. And I know everyone's in for a treat. Wonderful that you are offering this series for everyone. I'm going to be in transit, so I'm going to turn off my screen and listen, but I will be with you despite that. Sending my love to all.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Shuli. Mazal Tov. And
Thank you.
without further ado, I hand it off to the teacher that will always have a special place in my heart, Ed Greenstein. Thank you for being with us.
Okay. Well, thank you, Shuli, for all you've done. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, uh, Josh, for organizing all of this. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Um, I can see already that I know most of you. One of you I know virtually my whole life. I'd like to start by showing you what I'm planning to do uh, during these 4 sessions. So I'm going to try to share the screen. You know, I'm at two with technology, but I will try to get this right. Okay, I hope you can all see this. So the topics that we're going to do each session, more or less, are the test of Job and how it plays out. The second topic next week is Job sues God, or Job's lawsuit against the deity. The week after, Job and his friends talking past each other. And then there'll be a break around American Independence Day. And then the world according to Job. We'll have to see what that will be about. Okay, I'm now going to stop sharing that. Um, the rabbis have a midrash, and I'm sorry for those people who have studied Job with me. I see among us maybe the best student I ever had in a course on Job. So I apologize for having to repeat anything like this. But the rabbis have a midrash, which is found both in the Talmud and in a big midrash collection, where they tried to pin down the time in which the story of Job took place. And the reason that they attach the book of Job to each of these different periods is based usually on a word or some kind of association with a character. So they start by saying that the book of Job takes place in the time of Abraham, right? The first of Israel's forefathers. And then it says, no, it took place in the time of Jacob, and it took place at the time of the tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. It took place during the time that the Israelites were in Egypt. It took place during the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, right? And then they keep going all the way down to the time of Achashverosh as Ahasuerus, right, in the story of Purim, because in the story of Purim, you remember that the Persian king, where the Jews are a minority in the Persian diaspora, and the king uh, gets rid of his wife for sexist reasons, and then he has a beauty contest to choose the next wife. And it happens that he chooses the Jewess Esther, and her Hebrew name Hadassah. In any case, because of the beauty that's involved, and because at the end of the book of Job, when Job is restored what he had before, in fact, mostly double what he had before, it makes there's special attention is paid to the beauty of Job's daughters. So beautiful daughters, right? Beauty contest in Persia, it all fits. But of course, they find a reason to attach Job to every period. And of course, the meaning is not that the rabbis were trying to be historical and trying to pin down the actual time of the story of Job, but they realized that the story of Job was a parable. It's a story about not one time, but every time. And that in any day and age, in any culture, there is there are characters like Job, right? People who are really good people, but bad things happen to them. To paraphrase Rabbi Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And so we have a story, right, about this fellow Job, which is not necessarily to be taken historically, but is to be taken very seriously because of what we can learn about people, about Job, and how his friends turn on him and somehow lack the ability to be friends to Job because they think there's some higher allegiance that they have to the deity, to God. And it's also about, of course, how God behaves in the world, which is something that's presented to us not by God and not by necessarily a prophet of God, someone who we think or in ancient times was thought to know God better than other people, but rather it's a thoughtful person in the Persian period who's thinking about God as looking around in the world, is trying to figure out how could a really good God who loves peace and goodness and kindness and is generous, how could really a good God allow the things that we see around us to happen? And so he writes this story, which was a traditional story, but he adapts it. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. He adapts it to the situation of his own time. And so he presents a God who, as we're soon going to see, behaves in a very distressing way. That's maybe the nicest way to put it. In the prologue to the book, and we see a character, Job, who has the hardest time trying to connect with this deity in the large middle part of the book. I'm now going to look at the book in terms of how I believe it was formed historically, because I think that even though we're going to look at the book, and I look at the book and I interpret the book the way that we find it, more or less the way that it is in the Tanakh. Um, Here, for example, is a Tanakh. Right? That's not the one I usually use, but it's one that I happen to be able to hold up right now. Um, it's I read it, I try to read it the way that I find it in the Tanakh, except for what I believe are scribal errors, in the same way that I don't interpret the typing of a chimpanzee as meaningful literature. In the same way, I don't accept scribal errors, right, as canonical texts, even though sometimes they make for very interesting reading. I'm not saying ignore them, but I believe that ancient texts were meant to be understood and were clear at one time, and that it's my job as a philologist to try to restore it. I try to restore the Hebrew text in the same way I would try to restore a text that was just discovered elsewhere in the ancient Near East, for example, in northern Syria at Ugarit or someplace else. Okay, so, but there is, I think, a value to appreciating how the book of Job might have come to be. And this is the most general way that I can put it. Now, let me see if I can share again. Where is it here? Can you see this?
No.
No. Okay. It's not showing. Hmm. Okay. So I don't know if Josh, if you have it there, maybe you can put it up on the formation of the book of Job, which I sent you earlier.
Let me look for it. I'll be right back.
Okay. Anyway, the idea is the following. I mean, I could hold it like this, but it would be backwards. Okay. The the book of Job is framed by a prose tale, right? A tale that's told like all biblical narratives in prose style. It resembles stories from the Torah, from Genesis, stories from Judges and Samuel and Kings. It resembles stories like Ruth and Jonah. Um, but I believe that it has two original parts to it. Okay, one part is the part without the Satan, right? That is, I think we can show that the parts with the Satan, that is the adversary in heaven, the angel whose job it is to trip people up and then to find fault with them and bring them to God's attention for failing to do what they're supposed to be living up to, right? So that whole part with the Satan is, I think, added on in the Persian period when we have the Satan as an independent character. How do I know this? Okay, if you open up or look at Job chapter 1, and I hope that you have either my translation or somebody's translation there. When you open up, right, um, chapter 1, you see in verse 5 about um, the uh, the event that Job's children would hold, and the way I understand it is on each of the sons' birthdays. So 7 times a year. Now let's see if this works. Ah, here we have it. No, that's the last one. So I hope I don't lose that. But that's not the one I want. It's the one that's called the formation. Okay, just so listen. Okay, so so there you have a description of Job's children eating and drinking at their parties. And then we have a section that says, on a certain day, the sons of Elohim, that is the angels, came to station themselves around Yud-Vavhe, that's the name of Israel's God, and the Satan too came among them. And they have this whole discussion. And then after the Satan, um, oh, here it is. Let's see if I can manipulate this. Okay, could you, all right, you don't have to lower it yet, but I can't manipulate this one since you put it up. Okay, just leave it there for a second. Okay, so verses 1 to 5, and then verse 13 continues this part of the story. On a certain day, his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine. So why do I say that this section in the middle, right, doesn't belong, right? Chapter verses 6 through 12 with the Satan, because it says in verse 12 that the Satan took leave of Adonai, or of Yud-Vavhe. The Satan took leave. And then it says, on a certain day, his sons and daughters. Who are his sons and daughters? Well, they're not God's sons and daughters, and they're not the Satan's sons and daughters. In fact, they're Job's sons and daughters. So this part was stuck in at a certain point, although it's part of the book as we now know it. In fact, and at the end of the book, in the epilogue, there is no Satan. Also, Job's wife is not there. And Job's wife only appears in the second part of the prologue in chapter 2, where we have um, um, both the Satan and Job's wife. All right, we'll come back to that. Okay, meanwhile, that's the prose narrative in the prologue. Okay, then we have the prose narrative in the epilogue, right, where again, there's no Satan and no wife. Okay, so this whole idea of why is the Satan there in the first place? It's obviously there in order to remove the bad things that happened to Job from the direct work of God. In other words, at one point, when the first part of the story was written, it wasn't so terrible to ascribe bad things to God. God sometimes does bad things to good people, and we know that God does it for a test. We're going to talk about the test in the balance of today's session. Nevertheless, uh, there is a tendency in the Persian period to try to remove God from doing bad things to people in a direct way. Okay, and so in the epilogue, we don't have it at all. And in fact, in the epilogue, if you look there in Job 42, verse 11, when Job is restored, they came to him, all his brothers and all his sisters and all his friends from beforehand. And they ate a meal with him in his house, which of course parallels the meals that his children had in the beginning of the story. There's a lot of balancing and symmetry between the prologue and the epilogue. And they shook their heads in pity, and they consoled him for all the evil that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Adonai, the God, had brought upon him. So it's made very clear here that it was God who did all of this bad stuff to Job. And it's only through this extra layer of text that was added on in a second stage that brought the Satan into the situation. Nevertheless, bringing the Satan into the situation makes the story much more interesting, and it also brings out certain ideas, and we're going to discuss them very shortly. Okay, then we have the dialogues in the middle of the book, right? There's one round where Job's three friends react to his opening monologue. There's round one. I guess I forgot to put his opening monologue over here in the structure. Then there's round one. Then there's round two, and then there's an incomplete round three. So far, the third friend doesn't appear there. And chapters 25 and 26 all belong to Bildad, and none of it to Job, as you'll see if you read my commentary with the introduction to each of the discourses carefully. Then we have an intervening monologue by Job, where he has a reverie about the good old days when he was respected and when people would come to him, including an oath of innocence. An oath of innocence is when you can't get. I'm going to talk about this much more next week when we talk about Job's lawsuit against God. Nevertheless, I'll say a word about it, which is that if you can't get someone you're trying to sue, right, to appear in court, what you do is you take an oath up and down and up and down. I didn't do this. I didn't do it. You think anything you put wrong that you could possibly have done, you swear that you didn't do. And that puts the burden on the opposite party to appear and answer. And that's what we have in Job's monologue. Okay. Then the next stage in the formation of the book were the deities' discourses from the windstorm, and I think that that's part of the original book. There's a first response, and then there's a second response, and Job responds to each of these responses, and I'm going to talk about them toward the end of the course when we talk about Job's view of the world. And then we have some extra layers that are added to the book. We have a fourth character, Elihu, and he's brought into the book by an unsatisfied reader of the early edition of the book, right? Because when God appears to Job out of the windstorm, God is all about power, all about controlling nature, and hardly pays any attention whatsoever to goodness or justice or even caring about human beings. We'll talk more about that in the last session. Or you can read ahead and see my comments and interpretations that precede each section of the book. In any case, someone was unhappy with that, and so added the Eliud discourses. The Eliud speeches, the Eliud speeches contain virtually all of the same ideas that God includes in God's panoramic view of nature and creation, but Elihu adds two things that are missing. First of all, a commitment to divine justice, and second of all, a tremendous concern for human beings. And this we don't have in the God speeches. So someone felt that was a lack. Now, by putting the LU speeches in front of the God speeches, the idea, I think, was to put a spin on the God speeches. The way I look at it is the opposite. Elihu makes his speeches attributing some justice and some concern from human beings to God, and then God comes along and, in a sense, right, avoids all of that, right? As if he annuls all of those additions that Elihu had made. So I think that its placement leads to a total irony. In any case, there's one other pious addition that was made to the book in the second half of chapter 24, which doesn't have to detain us right now. Okay, can we take this off right now? Josh, thank you very much. Okay, so now we're going to look at the beginning of the book. Okay, the story is told like, as some of the ancient rabbis said, it's a mashal, it's a parable, right? It's a story that's meant to exemplify something, to illustrate something, to make a point, right? But we're not supposed to take it too literally. I think for the rabbis, the killing of Job's children, for example, was something that was so upsetting that they couldn't believe that God would actually do such a thing deliberately. But in a story, a folk tale, not quite a fairy tale, because there's nothing really fairy-like about any of this. But in this kind of parable, you can have room for the fantastic. And of course, what you have here that's fantastic is God's appearance out of the windstorm. But nothing else in the story is really so fantastic, unless, of course, you see the interchanges between God and the angels in heaven as being something that was fantastic. I think that in ancient times that was not seen as fantastic, although you may see it that way. In any case, we find many things that are familiar from other folk tales. For example, it begins in a kind of once upon a time way, so that if you look in chapter 1, verse 1, a man there was in the land of Uz. Job, Eov, was his name. You see, by introducing the man, once there was a man, and then telling you later what his name was, that's a kind of folktale phenomenon. And that man was whole in heart and straight of path, fearing of Elohim. God-fearing means a lot more than just being pious. It also means being a really decent person and turning from evil. Okay, so there we have the beginning of the book, which is the way that a folktale goes, and we also have the numbers 3 and 7 and 10, which of course is the combination of 3 and 7, right? Some of you who went to school with me a long time ago, will be proud that I still remember addition in that way. Okay, in any case, 3 and 7, and sometimes you have 5, but the 5 is really times 2, so the 5 makes 10, and then you have another 5 to add to the 5, so it makes 10 again. Okay, the only interesting thing that I actually just was thinking about and writing about today was that it talks about the four corners of the house where Job's children were eating and drinking, and that this wind hit the four corners of the house so that it collapsed on his children. That number 4 is oddball, I would say, in this context, and maybe it's to call attention to the outrageousness of what's being described, or at least the outlandishness of what's being described. just an idea. In any case, we now come to a verse that is extremely important. Okay, but it's been uh, usually understood in one of two ways, and usually, I think, in the wrong way. Okay, so we read in verse 2, there were born to him, Job, Eov, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And his livestock were 7,000 small cattle, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of large cattle, which means, because a yoke is two, 1,000 large cattle, 500 she-asses, to get the 500 and the 500 together to make 10, and a very large servantry. This word servantry, I'll just make a comment, it's in my footnote also, and that is that this word is found elsewhere only in the book of Genesis, chapter 26, and it's describing the wealth of Abraham's son Isaac, who's also the father of Jacob, the second of Israel's patriarchs, and describes all of his wealth in a similar way, which is the way that I think the storyteller is trying to place the story in way ancient times, in the times in like lots of stories. It happened way down way in the past, long time ago, like Star Wars. But in any case, uh, that's not what I want to talk about now. I want to talk about there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. And here's the question. Were these children born to him as part of the exposition of the story? That is, in the same way that he was whole in heart, straight of path, fearing of Elohim, turning from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. Was that part of the beginning of the story? Or was that a reward or blessing given into him by God for having been God-fearing and such a good person? Most interpreters understand it as a blessing that came to him because he was so good. However, I have checked this out. I even wrote to a colleague at Haifa University who's an expert on Second Temple Hebrew and wrote a whole book on the verb in Second Temple Hebrew, Oad Cohen, who also was at one time, maybe if not a student of mine, definitely a colleague. In any case, I asked Ohad, and he confirms for me, you can't tell. This is ambiguous. Oh, well, when you've got an ambiguity, you've got to look at it both ways. And so we have to look at this both ways. And we have to ask ourselves, when we see Job's behavior in the continuation of the story, is this a Job who was behaving really well and was God-fearing in order to get blessings? In other words, in order to be rewarded for it? Or was this a Job who was just a really good person and a really pious person? And he also was blessed with all these children and all this wealth, which of course gives you the background for the testing of Job by removing all of these things. You see, you can't remove these things from Job unless he has them. So there's no story unless he's got all of this wealth and he's got these 10 children. So I'm not going to decide it necessarily for you, but I would ask you to look at that as a possibility. Now, who decided to play on this possibility? The Satan. And this lies behind the test of Job. And you won't find a sufficient number of commentators, I think, who will point it out in a clear way. Okay, but I will now try to get to share screen and get this, just a minute, and get this up there. You see it? The test of Job and the test of the deity? Someone tell me you can see it.
Yes.
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 Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Gary.
Very good. And I can manipulate this because I put it up. Okay, good. Now, this is the test of Job. Okay, in order to understand it, so we've got to um, look a little bit at the text starting in chapter 1, verse 6. On a certain day, the sons of Elohim came to station themselves around Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, right? Israel's God, the Lord, right? And you see, the narrator of the story is an Israelite, even though Job is meant to be, someone who belongs to the people of the Transjordan in the East. I haven't talked about that. We'll have occasion to talk about that especially when we talk about Job and his friends, which is the third session, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, the Satan too came among them. Okay, we've already talked about the Satan. The Satan is one of the divine beings, one of the divine messengers, as they're called, or the sons of Elohim. And the Satan belongs to their number, and he came along too. So already we know something is up, right? Why not say that Michael was there, or Gabriel was there, or one of the other angels, Raphael? Why not mention one of the other angels who's mentioned somewhere in the Bible? Why only the Satan? Ah, because the Satan is significant here. Okay, Adonai said to the Satan, okay, how many angels were there? I don't know. Were there a dozen? Were there 2 dozen? Were there 100? Were there 1,000? I don't know. How many servants do you think God, as the royalty of the world has? How many do you think were there? Lots. So why does God turn only to the Satan? Because God has an agenda here, and the agenda is to get the Satan to do what he knows the Satan does. And what the Satan does is he finds fault with people, he reports on their faults to God, and he prosecutes them so that God will punish them for the things that they've done wrong. Okay, this I know is a kind of primitive way of looking at divine justice, but that's how it's presented in this story. When the story was actually written and transmitted, was it understood that way, in terms of contemporary theology? I really don't know. Okay, but maybe. But that's not what interests me right now. What interests me now is understanding the logic of the test. Okay, so let's continue reading. Adonai said to the Satan, whence do you come? And the Satan answered Adonai, from roving the earth and from going all about it. In other words, he's been checking up on all of us, right? And Adonai said to the Satan, have you set your mind on my servant Job? In other words, he's calling attention. He could have called attention to you, or to you, or to you, or to me. But instead, he calls attention only to one individual, Job. Why? Because there is none like him on earth, a man whole in heart and straight of path, fearing of Elohim and turning from evil. He quotes directly from the so-called objective report of the narrator of the story. Okay, so what's behind the test of Job? Fact one, Job behaves perfectly piously. Fact two, Job is richly blessed. Claim of the deity, Job behaves perfectly and piously. He just said that. But now comes the Satan with his challenge. Challenge A vis-a-vis Job, based on these two facts. Verse 9, the Satan answered Adonai and said, is it for nothing that Job is God-fearing? In other words, does he do it, just out of the goodness of his heart, or does he have an agenda to get something out of it? You have put a hedge around him and around his household and around all that is his. That means you have been protecting him. Okay, what does it mean to protect? Okay, to protect a person in ancient times means not to allow demons and other gods, if you believe in other gods, to do damage to that person. People took these demons very, very seriously, these bad, evil spirits and demons, way through the Christian era, right? Through most of the first millennium of our era, right? 1,000 years after the book of Job was written, right? Jews and others in Babylonia were um, were making amulets and were ordering from artisans and from magicians what we call magic bowls. These are mostly ceramic bowls that have incantations written all around them, sometimes with interesting pictures in the middle. If you're around any museum that has antiquities from the ancient Near East, they're bound to have some. There are hundreds, maybe thousands or more of these bowls in existence today that have been excavated. In Jerusalem alone, there are dozens of these bowls that you can see. If you're in New York, uh, lots of bowls. If you're in most major areas where there are museums, you can see these magic bowls, or you can just go to Google and you'll see lots of pictures of magic bowls. Okay, what people would do with these magic bowls is they would take out incantations mostly against an enemy who wished them ill. So, in other words, what God had been doing for Job was without incantations, he's just been protecting him from all the bad things that can happen. If you want to know what kinds of bad things people were afraid of, go read Psalm 91. We're not going to do that right now, but give yourself a little assignment, right? Go read Psalm 91, which talks about all the different demons and things that people have to worry about. For example, stumbling on the road, right? Or you think of all sorts of dangers, a famine, right? All these kinds of things. So the Satan then makes a first challenge based on fact one and fact two. He says, yes, Job behaves perfectly and piously. He doesn't challenge that fact. He challenges fact two that that Job behaves perfectly, or he bases himself not on the ambiguity of fact. He's richly blessed. Yes, he's richly blessed, but why? Why is he richly blessed? Claimed by the Satan. Fact one follows from fact two, or really the other way around. It should be. Sorry, should be the other way around. I get confused sometimes. Okay. In other words, he's blessed because he was pious, etc. Or you could say because he was blessed, he acted piously. No, fact could be correct. Okay. In any case, Job behaves perfectly because he is blessed. Okay, that's why he behaves so well. You blessed him, therefore he behaves well. Yes, fact one follows from fact two. I had it right. That sometimes happens. Okay, challenge B of the Satan is implied. If Job is not perfect, then the deity is unjust for blessing him without cause. Huh. Most people don't think about that, but that is a logical consequence of if God is really blessing him, even though he doesn't deserve it. So doubt is raised in the mind of the deity. And so the deity puts Job to the test. Okay, now I'll just read the rest of that section from chapter verses 9 to 11. Is it for nothing that Job is Elohim fearing? You have put a hedge around him and around his household and around all that is his. You have blessed all that his hands do, so that his livestock have waxed abundantly in the land. However, send forth your hand. Notice the Satan is saying, you're the one who has to inflict Job with harm. Send forth your hand and affect all that is his. I swear he will bless, that meaning curse. It's a euphemism. It's found elsewhere in the Bible also. he will bless, that is, curse you to your face. That is the claim that is made by the Satan. Okay, now, who wants to put Job to the test? Who was it who who turned first to the Satan and drew his attention to Job? Who does the Satan think is going to be the one that's going to be testing Job? In the epilogue, who is it who gets all the credit, so to speak, for having brought misery on Job? Ah, so what we have here is the test of Job. Now, let's look a little further on, just so you see that I'm not I'm forcing too much onto this text. Okay. Um, uh, Look in chapter 2, where the Satan raises a question again about Job and says, you know, you've tested Job in terms of all of the things that are exterior to his person, right? In chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, the Satan answered Adonai and said, look, you know, it's skin for skin, which means one of two things, the way I see it. Either it means a person will trade his own skin for the skin of others. In other words, in order to protect himself, he's ready to say, well, bad things had to happen to somebody. I had to be afflicted. Better it's them rather than me, myself. Is that the kind of person Job is? I don't think so. But there is another interpretation, which I learned from my teacher, Professor H.L. Ginsburg of blessed memory. And that is that it could also mean there's skin beneath or behind skin. In other words, you've just touched the epidermis. But what you have to do is get beyond the epidermis, the outer skin, and get to Job himself. And if you affect Job himself, then he will curse you. But notice um, what God says to the Satan just before that in chapter 2, verse 3. Adonai said to the Satan, have you set your mind on my servant Job? None like him on earth. He's such a terrific person. And he still holds fast to his wholesomeness, so that you have tempted me to devour him for nothing. In other words, God is blaming the Satan for inciting God against Job. This is an outrageous.
¿Cómo es el matcha latte? ¿De qué tamaño? ¿Cuál es la taza grande?
I don't know who's speaking, but I would like that person not to be speaking now. There will be time at the end, I hope, for some questions, or else Josh is going to collect questions from the chat and is going to bring them to my attention so I can deal with them at the beginning of the next session 1 week from today at the same time, God willing. Okay, so God is sort of blaming the Satan for inciting him. There's a view in the Talmud, Rabbi Jonathan, who says that if it weren't written here in Scripture, I couldn't even believe it. Who could say such a thing? You know, that God could be tempted, incited, just like a person could be incited, right, by somebody else. It's such an outrageous theological idea. But Rabbi Yochanan says, I'm sorry, but it's in Scripture, so this is the way it is. Okay, but still, God is the one who affects Job. Okay, so look at verse 7 there. God says, okay, you can do what you want. Just keep him in life. And then it says, the Satan took leave of Adonai, and he struck Job with a terrible inflammation from the sole of his foot to the top of his head. He is ambiguous. It could refer to the Satan. It could refer to Adonai. if you read the epilogue to the book, right, and you try to uh, um, conform this verse with the epilogue to the book, who was it who actually afflicted Job? It was God. And some of the medieval commentators, few of them, some of the brightest ones, actually interpret it this way, that it was God who afflicted Job directly with the boils, with the skin inflammation, which is also, of course, one of the 10 plagues that God brought on the Egyptians, right, in order to get the Israelites to be released from servitude in Egypt. And who was it who brought the shechin, the inflammation then? It was God. Who brings the inflammation now? Might be God. And according to some of the interpreters, it is God, but at best it's ambiguous. So we have several verses that seem to put the direct onus for torturing Job on God. And we have a little bit of doubt in our minds that maybe the Satan had something to do with it. Now, why do I make this a big deal about this logic? First, I would like to go to the bottom of this page. Nota bene, remember that when Job's children were meeting in the house of whoever's brother was celebrating a birthday, and they were eating and they were drinking. And at first, it doesn't say they were drinking wine, but the word mishteh means a drink feast. And in fact, in the next two times that it's referred to, they are drinking, specifically drinking wine. You can check it out in the Hebrew or in my translation or in another good translation. In any case, nota bene, Job made a sacrificial offering for each of his children each time they got together and made a feast. Why? Because when you're having a feast and you're drinking, you could get a little tipsy. And when you get a little tipsy, you could do something that you're not supposed to do. And what might the children have done? They certainly wouldn't have cursed God or blasphemed God out loud, but maybe they blasphemed God in their hearts. So, if just in case they did that, Job's behavior is to make an offering for them, to atone for them, just in case. In other words, Job's behavior is also motivated by a suspicion of wrongdoing. He has a doubt about how pious his children would have remained while they were drinking. And so he also operates in this mode of doubt, you might say. And when his children are killed, I simply ask this question. I don't even like this question, but to be honest, I have to ask it. When his children are killed, might he, Job, have concluded that his proactive pious acts for the sake of his children were not enough? And maybe God actually did something to them because of what he suspected they might have done. In any case, what happens in the rest of the book? Okay, what I am claiming is that for the rest of the book, Job is testing God exactly the way that God tested him. Fact number one, I behave perfectly and piously. Fact number two, I am afflicted. So Job's challenge vis-a-vis the deity is, I seem to be punished unjustly. It seems wrong that you are afflicting me, which is, of course, right, what the Satan was saying to God, to the deity. You may be afflicting Job. You may be rewarding Job unjustly. You may be unjust. Job also thinks maybe the deity is being unjust. Doubt is raised in Job's mind, but he's not 100% sure. So in the way I understand it, Job does not curse God. He falls just short of that. In the beginning of chapter 3, it says specifically he curses the day on which he was born and the night on which he was conceived. He could have cursed God, but he doesn't do that. Other people, like my friend, the late great scholar Michael Fox, who was a brilliant scholar of biblical wisdom literature, he thought that if you add up all of the terrible things that Job says about God, you would have to conclude that Job has, in fact, blasphemed. He may not have leveled a curse against God, but he blasphemed and did not speak correctly. Nevertheless, I would argue that Job falls short of that. But in order to find out what it is that the deity seems to be holding over Job's head, why is the deity afflicting him? Because Job also thinks that God should be working justly, just like the Satan thinks that God should be operating justly. So Job sues the deity for an explanation. Job puts the deity to the test. And it's that we're going to be looking at next week. Job's lawsuit against God, how he begins thinking about it, where he gets the idea from the prophet Jeremiah, how he first toys with the idea, and actually then how he pursues it. And we'll be reading some parts of the book in order to appreciate that. I would just like to say one thing about this book, and that in the epilogue, because we may not have much time during the course to talk about the epilogue, and that is that Job is given back, restored double of everything that he had before, except he has the same 3 daughters. But I'll talk about this in a minute. He gets back double the number of cattle that he had: large cattle, small cattle, camels, all of that. Right? He gets all of that back, double. Why do you get it back double? Because as I explain in a footnote, when you're a thief and you take something away illegitimately, you've got to pay back double. So at least one way to look at it is that God has not really had a good reason. God has had an egotistical reason for testing Job. Why? Because God wants to know how deeply devoted Job is to God. He doesn't know how devoted he is. Would he be like Abraham, who was ready to sacrifice his son? In this case, it's a really different kind of test. First of all, Job doesn't know he's being tested. Second of all, it's a test. It's a kind of sadistic kind of test. How many blows will you take before you will curse me? That's what God wants to know. And of course, no matter how many blows Job takes, he doesn't curse God. So in a sense, he passes the test, but the test isn't officially called over till the end of the book. Then he's restored. He gets double everything. And then he gets, according to my translation and most interpretations, he gets 7 sons back and 3 daughters back. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. And I think if you have the soft cover of my translation, there was one half of a verse, one line that I changed. I had the publisher change between the hardcover and the soft cover. And now I think I may have them change another word, because instead of having getting 7 sons back, the word in Hebrew is Shivana, and Shivana doesn't occur anywhere else. And it's usually interpreted as a fancy form of 7. But now I'm thinking it's 14. And I have a few really good commentaries, like Edward Dorm, who see it. I think it's Dorm. Anyway, a few good commentators see it this way also. And that's the way the Aramaic Targum, the ancient Aramaic translation, takes it. And now I think that that's what it is, because it's a blessing of Job. Now, I don't want to offend anybody. These are not my values. In the same way that the theology of Job is not my theology. Okay, even though I may argue forcefully for a particular theological understanding of Job, it's not my personal theology. And these are not my personal values. Nevertheless, in ancient times, and in some societies still today, having more sons is a great blessing because they help you around the house. You're right. They do the work. They help manage the fields and all that stuff. But he only has three more daughters. Now you could say, well, daughters are a burden. You have to marry them off or whatever. However, these daughters, you see, there's a kind of compensation for having only three daughters. Not only are they named, each of them, in relation to some kind of beauty or beautifulness or loveliness, but they also are said to be the most beautiful women around. They're the most beautiful daughters. So they're not going to have trouble, getting a shidduch, a match or anything like that. They're not going to be a burden to him, certainly not more than the three daughters he had in the first place. Okay, I may be wrong about this. And if you have objections and you know me so that can have a conversation, you can write to me about it or something. Okay, nevertheless, I'm not sure about that either. Doubt. Nevertheless, we've come to the end of our hour. So I'm going to conclude, by saying that there is a doubt in God's mind. That's what sets the test in motion. There's a doubt in Job's mind, which accounts for most of the book. And there's a doubt in all of our minds about certain things, certain verses and words in the book. And there should be a doubt in everybody's mind, that we really understand the book of Job. We're never going to understand everything. And I don't claim to understand everything. I've done the best I can for now. I think I've done not bad, for someone living in this day and age. Nevertheless, right, there's always going to be a doubt, and there always are going to be better understandings. And you too may come up with better understandings of some of what we're discussing or a lot of what we're discussing. I certainly have learned some very important things and you may hear about them later on during the course from some of the readers of my translation. So I hope we'll all learn something from each other. And I see that there are a bunch of comments in the chat. Matt Berkowitz, are we going to look at some of the things in the chat, or are we going to try to round them up and see who's asking the same questions and discuss them next time?
Why don't we take a look at the questions and we'll categorize like you suggested, and we could discuss next time.
Okay.
We've got quite a wide variety of questions. But one question that we could take now, Ed.
Yes.
Rick Muller asks, how does Yivarechecha in chapter 1, verse 11 and 2:5 translate to curse instead of bless? Wouldn't the easy word by some form of
right. So in ancient Hebrew, the idea of cursing God was anathema, right? It's just you just shouldn't say such a thing. It's just pasnicht, as they say in Yiddish. It's just an unseemly thing to say or do. And so elsewhere in the Bible, the most famous case is in the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings, I think it's chapter 21, 20, I think it's 21. In any case, Naboth Ahab is the king of Israel, and he has a summer home in Jezreel, where it's really nice in the winter. And he has a wife who's a Phoenician princess, Jezebel, right? And he really wants to own this plot of land, this vineyard or this orchard that's right next to his land, but it belongs to somebody else. And he goes to this fellow Naboth who owns it, and he says, I'd really like to buy it from you. And he says, I won't sell it to you. Now, there's an ambiguity also. Does he mean I won't sell it, or I won't sell it to you? But that's not the issue right now. The thing is that Jezebel sees her husband, Ahab, in misery. And she says, "What's the matter?" And he tells her the story. And she arranges, right, to incriminate Navot, right? She pays to have two witnesses come to the king or to magistrate, I think to the king, and say, "This man Navot has cursed both God and king," which is a capital offense. That way, you get rid of the man, and the king can appropriate his property. And the word that's used for curse there is livarech. But of course, you don't bring somebody up on criminal charges for blessing God and the king. To all interpreters, it means to bless. Now, what uh, uh, is being suggested here is that yes, there is an irony that bless is used in both of these ways in the story of the prologue to the story of Job, right? He was being blessed with blessings, with riches and family. Okay, but the word for cursing God is also livarech, yivarecheka. He'll even curse you to your face brazenly. And it's been suggested that this ambiguity is one that we're really meant to think about throughout the entire story, and that maybe there's a little bit of blessing and curse in each of the others. There's a very fine biblical scholar whom I know called Todd Linnefelt, and he's written an interesting article suggesting that the interpretation of levarech, to bless or curse, is undecidable in this story. I don't agree with him. I don't agree with him. I think it's ironic, however, and it's one of the many ironies that characterize the entire book of Job.
Thank you so much, Ed. This was an extraordinary arc over the past hour, and we cannot thank you enough for the blessing of your Torah. I want to encourage everyone, if you haven't gotten a copy of Ed's commentary on the book of Job, please do so. I would say one of the most extraordinary parts of this book is the footnotes. There's a whole lot of Torah, not only in the translation itself, but also in the footnotes of the book. So Ed, thank you so much. We're already looking forward to the journey ahead to the next 3 classes. And I want to thank you all in our virtual Beit Midrash for joining us from all over the world. Truly, Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, truly words of Torah came forth from Zion tonight. And wherever you are in this world, we wish you Erev Tov, Tzoraim Tovim, Boker Tov, and please God, a day and week of peace ahead, Shavua Tov. Thank you for joining us.
Before you close, I just want to say what a pleasure it has been to see many of you, some of you whom I haven't seen in a very long time. And as I say, one of you I know your entire life, right? And the other knows me virtually my entire life. And aside from many other people who I'm very pleased to see here. So take care, and I hope I'll see all of you. And you know that there will be an instruction coming from Josh about how to access the recording should you need it, or should you know someone who needs it. It will come during the week. Shalom, ulhitraot. I hope to see you again soon.
Shavua Tov all.
Shavua
Be well.
tov.
Yashikach and Erev Tov.